August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. The narrative cemented in history is that these atomic bombings were a necessary evil, an agonizing decision that ended World War II and saved millions of lives by preventing a bloody invasion of Japan. This story provides a comforting moral calculus, justifying the vaporization of over 200,000 human beings in the blink of an eye. But what if this universally accepted truth is one of the most pervasive and consequential myths of the 20th century? What if the bombings were not militarily necessary at all? The dark truth suggests the annihilation of these cities wasn't the final act of World War II, but the terrifying opening salvo of the Cold War, a decision driven less by saving American lives and more by raw geopolitical ambition and the dawn of atomic diplomacy. Welcome back to DC Explore. The decision to deploy nuclear weapons against civilian populations remains the single most controversial act in the history of warfare, forcing humanity across a threshold from which we have never returned. In today's video, we will rigorously examine the evidence, the high-level dissent within the U.S. military itself, and the political maneuvers that shaped the post-war world. We confront the ultimate question: were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a military necessity required to end a brutal war? Or do they constitute one of history's greatest war crimes, committed to secure global dominance? To understand this story, we first need to immerse ourselves in the brutal context of the summer of 1945. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, but the war in the Pacific continued with a ferocity that shocked the world. The battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima saw Japanese forces fighting almost to the last man, internalizing a code that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. This tenacity fueled the primary justification for the atomic bombs: Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. American planners projected catastrophic casualties, with some estimates reaching up to 1 million American dead and millions more Japanese. This horrifying calculus faced President Harry Truman. Simultaneously, the $2 billion Manhattan Project reached its climax with the successful Trinity test in July 1945, providing Truman with a weapon of unprecedented power and creating immense political pressure to utilize this massive investment. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies issued their declaration: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. This is the official narrative. However, this context deliberately ignores the reality of Japan's situation. By mid-1945, Japan was utterly crippled. Its navy was sunk, its air force decimated, and the U.S. naval blockade had caused widespread starvation and the total collapse of industrial production, severing access to essential raw materials and oil. Furthermore, General Curtis LeMay's conventional bombing campaign had already leveled dozens of Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 alone killed over 100,000 people, a higher death toll than the immediate impact of Hiroshima. The U.S. could already destroy Japanese cities at will. The evidence of Japan's desperation was clear to American intelligence. The first detail that shatters the official narrative is that Japanese leadership was actively seeking surrender well before August 1945. Intercepted diplomatic cables, known as the Magic Intercepts, revealed that Japan was desperately trying to use Moscow, which was still neutral in the Pacific, as a mediator to negotiate an end to the war. The sticking point was not the refusal to surrender, but the Allies' rigid demand for unconditional surrender. The Japanese leadership desperately sought one condition: the preservation of the Emperor Hirohito, whom they viewed as divine. They feared his removal or execution as a war criminal. Many within the Truman administration, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson, argued for modifying the surrender terms to allow the emperor to remain as a figurehead, believing this would secure an immediate surrender. But Truman, heavily influenced by Secretary of State James Burns, refused. Burns believed any concession would signal weakness, particularly to the Soviet Union. Historians argue that if Truman had simply guaranteed the emperor's safety earlier, a concession the USS, granted after the bombings anyway, to ensure post-war stability, the war might have ended months earlier. The refusal to modify the terms appears to have deliberately prolonged the war, providing the justification needed to use the atomic bombs. This is corroborated by the U.S. government's own post-war analysis. A 1946 United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded unequivocally, certainly, prior to the 31st of December 1945, and in all probability, prior to the 1st of November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. If the official assessment concluded the war was won, why deploy weapons of mass destruction against civilians? Perhaps the most shocking revelation is the significant and vocal dissent from the highest ranks of the American military leadership at the time, the individuals who knew the strategic situation best. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander and future president, voiced his opposition when informed of the plan. He later recounted, "I voiced to him, Secretary of War Stimson, my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion ... to Admiral William D. Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff and the highest-ranking U.S. military officer during the war, was even more scathing in his assessment. The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. In being the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Even figures like General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz expressed views that the bomb was not militarily essential. If the military consensus was that the war was effectively won and the bombs unnecessary, we must look for the real motivations elsewhere. However, that's not all. The more terrifying evidence lies in the emergence of atomic diplomacy. The real target of the bombs may not have been Tokyo, but Moscow. At the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin had promised to enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany's defeat. This deadline was rapidly approaching. August 8th, Truman and his administration were increasingly fearful of Soviet expansion in Asia, mirroring their takeover of Eastern Europe. Ending the war abruptly, before the Soviets could claim significant territorial gains and a role in the post-war occupation of Japan, became the overriding priority for Washington. The atomic bomb was viewed by Secretary of State James Burns not primarily as a weapon of war, but as a master card in the ensuing diplomatic confrontation with the Soviet Union. Burns believed the bomb would make Russia more manageable in Europe, demonstrating the bomb's apocalyptic power in a real war scenario. On actual cities, would intimidate the Soviet Union and establish unquestioned American hegemony in the emerging New World Order. The timeline strongly supports this interpretation of a race against the Soviets. Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th. the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. On August 8th, Nagasaki was destroyed on August 9th. The rush to use the second bomb, only 3 days after the first, seems dictated more by the rapid Soviet advance and the desire to demonstrate the full U.S. arsenal. Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb, different from the uranium bomb used on Hiroshima. It was certainly not dictated by allowing Japan sufficient time to assess the damage and respond. In fact, many Japanese leaders later admitted that the shock of the Soviet invasion, which extinguished their last hope of a negotiated settlement via Moscow and raised the specter of communist occupation, was equally, if not more, decisive than the atomic bombings in forcing their ultimate surrender. Finally, we must confront the profound moral implications of the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and the chilling criteria used for target selection. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen not primarily for their military significance, although they contained some military assets. They were chosen because they were relatively undamaged by conventional bombing. The U.S. Target Committee wanted pristine cities to accurately measure the bomb's full destructive potential. This turned the bombings into a horrific scientific experiment, prioritizing data collection over minimizing civilian casualties. The goal was explicitly psychological terror, to maximize civilian casualties in order to break the enemy's will. This strategy directly contradicts the principles of the laws of war, which mandate a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The immediate aftermath was hell on earth, with tens of thousands vaporized instantly. This was followed by the new, terrifying horror of radiation sickness, the atomic plague, which killed thousands more in the ensuing months and years, creating a legacy of indiscriminate killing that persists long after detonation. The targeting of civilians on this scale, when alternatives such as a demonstration blast, modifying surrender terms, or waiting for the impact of the Soviet invasion were available, but dismissed, challenges the very foundations of just war theory. It pushes the action firmly into the definition of a war crime. Thus, we can see that the conventional narrative of the atomic bomb as a necessary evil required to save lives crumbles under the weight of historical evidence, military testimony, and the geopolitical realities of 1945. The evidence strongly suggests Japan was already defeated and seeking a way out, and that alternatives were deliberately bypassed. The decision appears driven primarily not by military necessity, but by the desire to intimidate the Soviet Union, control the post-war order, and validate the massive investment of the Manhattan Project. Geopolitical advantage was prioritized over the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just a tragedy of the past. It is the foundational trauma of the nuclear age. It established the dangerous precedent that weapons of mass destruction are legitimate tools of statecraft, leading directly to the arms race and the precarious balance of terror that defines our world today. It forces us to confront how official narratives can be constructed to obscure uncomfortable truths for decades. And this leads us to today's big question. After seeing the full picture, including the evidence that the bombings were likely unnecessary and driven by geopolitical motives, how does this change our understanding of the morality of the nuclear age and the ethical responsibilities of global powers? Should the international community formally re-examine the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the context of war crimes, or does the context of total war justify actions that would be unthinkable in any other circumstance? Should we actively rewrite what is being taught in textbooks about the end of World War II to reflect this complex reality? And more importantly, is there another piece of common knowledge that you have always doubted and that you want DC Explore to uncover with you in the next video? Leave your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree, in the comment section below. We believe the truth always requires multifaceted dialogue, and we read all of your comments. If you value perspectives that go against the grain and believe history needs to be viewed honestly, please support us with a like on this video. And if you believe these stories need to be more widely known, please share the video. Of course, if this is your first time at DC Explore, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because we have many more hidden truths waiting to be discovered. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next video.